And now I'll turn the program over to the chairman of the Overby Center, our own Charles Overby.
Thank you, Curtis. It's great to see everybody here tonight and to have a good conversation. This is going to be a terrific program. Curtis is our inaugural and senior fellow at the Overby Center, and Greg Brock is our newest fellow at the Overby Center. And Greg is really the major domo of guiding this program tonight. He teaches a class in the Honors College on fake news. And he has gotten a terrific person to join us who deals with fake news every day. And he's known her for a long time. Most of you know that Greg had a very distinguished journalism career, including stints at the Washington Post and then a long time at the New York Times, where he retired and then, fortunately for us, decided to come to Oxford. And so, Greg, I'm going to let you start it off, and I'll jump in as I see fit.
Please do. Please do. Yeah, I've been asked many times since moving here, do you miss New York? And the answer is always, well, I miss the people. This would be Exhibit A, Margaret. We did know each other, worked closely at the Times some years ago. She's now the media columnist for the Washington Post since 2016, I think. And when I knew her, she was the public editor of the New York Times, ombudsman, they used to call it. And she began her career in Buffalo, at the Buffalo News. I guess one day we'll get to where we don't say this, but she was the first woman to hold the managing editor's job, number 2. She was the first woman there to hold the top editing job. And she was the first woman to be public editor of the New York Times. And for all you students, you should know that she started at the Buffalo News as an intern.
Summer intern.
See, it does work out.
Only took 19 years to be the boss.
That's right. But it happened. So, and I know one thing that Charles, like in Margaret's history or background, is that she was with the American Society of Newspaper Editors, but she chaired the First Amendment Committee when she was there. So I'll let you do the rest of the introduction before we plunge in directly to fake news. But just tell us, what does a media columnist do?
It's not anything that, thank you, Greg, and thank you, Charles. It's great to be here. This is my first trip to Mississippi. I arrived just this afternoon, and I've never been in the state before, and so far it seems pretty interesting and pretty great. So thank you very much for having me. You know, I don't think any little kid grows up thinking, wow, the thing I want to do in life is to be a media columnist. You know, it's not really something that you aspire to. But what I'm doing right now for the Washington Post is I write a column, so I express my opinion, and my subject matter is the news media. And I define it pretty broadly. I've written a lot of columns, for example, about social media. So I've written about, you know, the failures of Facebook when it comes to, you know, for example, what happened in New Zealand just a few days ago, the way that, you know, massacre unfolded by being live streamed onto Facebook, and the way it stayed up there. So, you know, I just give that as an example of, I'm not just writing about sort of newspapers or TV stations, but I do end up writing a lot about the cable networks, Fox, MSNBC, and CNN, which of course, you know, in different ways make everybody's blood pressure go up a lot. So that's a part of it. And I'm lucky because I kind of get to pick my topics, and I try really hard to write columns that are of, you know, I try to walk this sort of middle line that is of interest to people who know a lot about media and journalism, and it doesn't make them feel like I'm dumbing it down, but at the same time I try to make it really accessible to the non-expert. So that's kind of what I try to do, and otherwise I'm just constantly looking for column ideas and constantly nervous about the next one that I have to do. It's kind of, when you're a columnist, you always have the monkey on your back of, yeah, okay, I wrote today, but what's the next one? And of course, there's always the chance of falling on your face at any moment, so it's great. So that's that's kind of a general
Good.
sense of
That's
it.
great. Back in 2014, people defined fake news as purposeful lies in the form of news stories that went viral. Um, that's changed dramatically, the definition, and President Trump has certainly helped move that forward. So start us off,
Yeah.
what do you consider to be fake news? Now, when that term is used every day.
Sure. Well, as you said, the meaning has morphed. I think when it started off, it actually meant what it sounds like, which is fraudulent news or misinformation or news that is in the form of a news story that is meant to deceive. But then, kind of what's happened with it is that it's become, and I think, Greg, just casually this afternoon, you said it's become kind of a punchline for people. If you don't like something, you want to make fun of it, you call it fake news. President Trump has, this is my opinion, but I'm a columnist, so I get to say, right? When he doesn't like coverage, even though that coverage might be true, he calls it fake. And I do object to the way that it's been turned into a weapon, because I think when it becomes so common to hear this, and when every time someone doesn't like something, they call it fake news, I feel like it undermines this important part of our democracy, which is getting the truth out there. So when you're basically saying that legitimate media is a bunch of lies, it undercuts the good stuff. And obviously, I know very, very well that the people in the news media don't always get it right, and we make mistakes, lots of mistakes, and we have to correct them. But we do try to get it right, and we do try to correct ourselves when we get it wrong. So this business of, oh, that's fake news, is actually pretty harmful, in my opinion.
You had a column a while back. I showed Margaret, we were coming in, she saw the signs promoting this event, fake news, the truth. We should have called it the sobering truth about fake news. But
You can always edit that in.
exactly. A while back, you said that fake news, the term fake news, had had its 15 minutes of fame, and it was time to retire that. Can you talk a little about that?
I actually think that when we try to talk about misinformation or, bad stuff that some kids in some strange country are trying to put onto the internet to fake you out, that some politician is deathly ill or is on drugs or something, to undercut their campaign. If that is confused with this other thing, which is news I don't like, I think it's very, very confusing. I mean, there is a reason to continue to use the phrase fake news, which is kind of, it's like why we're here. It's a way to talk about this troubling subject in kind of a shorthand way that gets people interested. And I do think there is a real problem with media bias. We know that. So, I think that's a totally legitimate topic to talk about, that things aren't right or they're biased. But I wouldn't call. I like to refer to the reality-based press, and the reality-based press, in my opinion, is a really important part of what our country is all about, and it shouldn't be slammed as fake news.
So, Margaret, let's talk about the two elephants in the room. First, President Trump. As late as this morning, President Trump sent out a tweet saying fake news is the enemy of the people.
Yes.
And of course, we've gotten kind of blasé about that because he said it so often. Help us sort out that whole
Sure.
Trump fake news enemy of
Enemy
the
of the people thing. Well, it is. So the president had a very busy weekend with tweeting. He's often busy with tweeting, but this weekend he was particularly busy. I think on Sunday he tweeted 30 times, which I'm active on Twitter, but That's a lot. He was very happy to see that the Brazilian head of state, Bolsonaro, was also using the term fake news. He was proud. And again, this was being used not to describe propaganda or misinformation. It was being used to describe press I don't like. So that's sort of the fake news piece of it. The enemy of the people piece of it is also extremely troubling, because enemy of the people is a phrase that sort of has fascistic or it has a whole history of being used by autocrats and dictators. And so when it's used to describe the American press, and there's the First Amendment on the wall, I think that it actually really undermines our purpose, and I find it extremely offensive.
We'll have plenty of time to have a conversation with the audience about that. Now let's turn to Fox News. You wrote this blistering, and I think that's understating it, column about Fox News, and I wanted to read the first part of it and the last part of it, because I think you can tell us it got more reaction than anything you've written. You started out saying Chris Wallace is an exceptional interviewer, and Shepard Smith and Brett Baer are reality-based news anchors. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk about the overall problem of Fox News, which started out with bad intentions in 1996 and has swiftly devolved into what often amounts to a propaganda network for a dishonest president and his allies. And then you finished strong saying,
Yeah, tell us what you think.
Fox News can continue to function as something close to Trump TV. It can go on spreading disinformation, but everyone ought to see it for what it is, not a normal news organization with inevitable screw-ups, flaws, and commercial interests, which sometimes fail to serve the public interest. Instead, it's a shameless propaganda outfit which makes billions of dollars a year as it chips away at the core democratic values we ought to hold dear: truth, accountability, and the rule of law. Despite the skills of a few journalists who should have left long ago in protest, Fox News has become an American plague.
Right, it's a little opinionated. I was talking.
Let me say that this is one of the few places in the state of Mississippi where I could read this and it get applause.
That's true.
I know, and I recognize that it's, well, I have to recognize this because I got a lot of hate mail over this column. And I will say, I see there's a lot of women in the room and probably a lot of budding women journalists in the room, and I'll just take a quick little side step here to say that I have found that the divisiveness in the country and the bitter divisions have resulted in some really abusive communications that I've been on the receiving end of. And so this particular column, I kind of knew that it would get people riled up, but I got some really vicious email, and sometimes I have to actually turn it over to the security team at the Washington Post because it can get pretty ugly. I was talking to my editor this afternoon, and I published a column this morning. I was writing about what a diverse Democratic field of candidates we have. There's women, there's people of color, there's even a gay candidate, and yet who are the candidates we hear about? Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and Beto O'Rourke. So I was sort of bemoaning this. And so I asked my editor, well, how's the column doing? So when you ask these days, how's the column doing, you're not asking like, is it inspiring any great conversations? That is not what we're talking about. We're talking about how are the numbers, how are the metrics. And he said, no, it's doing well. It's getting a lot of readership. It's not quite the readership that your Fox is the actual devil column was last week. But I think possibly that column was a little overstated.
You said it drew
but-
6,000
Yeah,
comments.
it drew a lot of commentary, and sometimes you do take a strong stand to be provocative. But I actually do believe everything I said. I didn't say it to not do that. But it's really strange because these pieces that I've written about the cable networks get a lot of traction. And as we know, President Trump has made a particular target of CNN. You remember the chants, right? We won't say them right now, but and Fox News has its haters, and MSNBC has its haters. But the truth is that the cable networks are actually a pretty small part of the overall media system. For one thing, their viewership is very old, and they don't, on a particular night, in a particular primetime hour, they don't touch the viewership that Lester Holt's Evening News gets, or David Muir, or Jeff Glor. They are kind of they're kind of a strange little world, and they are in their own sort of echo chambers, and they each have their kind of their particular audience that they aim for.
If we had, Mississippi is one of the reddest states in the country, and so some people would say to you, well, what about MSNBC?
Yes.
What about CNN? They have things that are opinionated. Why aren't you outraged at them?
Yeah, I think there's a difference, and some people disagree with me, but I think that while CNN and MSNBC they may be coming at it from a slant, but I think they're dealing overall in the world of facts. And I'm afraid that too often and at critical times, Fox News is not dealing in the world of facts. They're dealing in the world of supporting a particular administration, and sometimes even dabbling into the very, very ugly world of conspiracy theories and things that don't belong on a news network. So, you can disagree with the politics of MSNBC, but I think you'd find that it's basically opinion based on fact. And, Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said, everyone is welcome to his own opinion, but you're not welcome to your own facts.
So building on that a little bit, compare for us your opinion of Sean Hannity versus Rachel Maddow.
Well, I think that Rachel Maddow is a liberal. Her show is coming at things from a progressive point of view. And I think that Sean Hannity is actually almost a part of the Trump administration. So that's a very different thing. I mean, I think overall, Rachel Maddow is a journalist. Granted, a kind of journalist veering into the world of entertainment, but still a journalist. I think that Sean Hannity is a political figure. I mean, he's campaigned with Trump. He talks to him on the phone every night. He's not in that world. And I think that so Fox News would say, well, that's okay, because we have our news coverage over here with these people, and we've got our opinion coverage. But the opinion coverage too often is not kind of coming out of the same world of factuality and reality.
Fox just hired Donna Brazile,
Yes.
former Democratic chairman.
That's
And
fascinating.
there's been some speculation that with Murdoch's son now head of Fox News, maybe it's going to take a more moderate slant.
Yeah, I think that I interpret that a little bit differently. For one thing, I think that Fox wants to keep portraying itself as a fair broker for news. And in order to be able to do that, given everything that's gone on there, they have to have some people they can point to and say, well, Shepard Smith, does a good news show, and look, we just hired Donna Brazile. But, that's kind of a drop in the bucket.
Shepard, you're not saying Shepard's a drop in the bucket. The only reason I say that, he went to Ole Miss.
No,
He's an Ole
I
Miss
actually, as you read in the first paragraph there, I admire
Yes, right.
his work, and I think he's terrific. I do wonder sometimes how he can how he can continue there. But then I also just read today that he's paid $7 million, or he just signed a $7 million contract. So I imagine that's part of the equation. Just guessing. I mean, maybe it doesn't matter. But so.
You also wrote about, at one point, which brings us back, of course, to Mr. Trump, that he actually doesn't believe his own rants.
Well, it's hard to know. It's hard to know. But I mean, I do think sometimes he's, Trump comes out of the world of reality TV, The Apprentice. He really comes, I mean, he also comes out of the world of being a real estate developer in New York. But I think a lot of what he does is for effect and for show and to sort of gin up his base and to make his base feel like he's their guy, which they do. I mean, he has a very, very, very loyal following, and he makes sure that he plays to that base. So I think that's, does he believe everything he says? Does he really? It's interesting because when he went to visit the New York Times early on, he, soon after he was elected, it was a very, very friendly meeting. And he even said to the publisher, that he felt that the Times was, I think the phrase was something like a world jewel. So he's a world jewel when he's visiting in their editorial meeting, but out on, on a campaign rally or a stage or something, they're the failing New York Times and it's the enemy of the people. So which one does he believe, or is it just sort of convenient to what the circumstances are? And I understand that politicians do tailor their messages and that they do spin, but I think this is kind of extreme. Yeah.
So he goes just as far to be specific about this story is fake news, and he knows good and well that
it's not.
It's just simply not.
Yeah, and I mean, we've even seen examples of this, when Michael Flynn, his national security advisor, was being, issues had come up about his truthfulness and whether he had misled people at the White House, even the vice president. And this was a story that the Washington Post did, and the president said, definitely branded that as fake. And yet, just a day after that, I think it was, Flynn was gone. Mm-hmm. And now, Flynn is caught up in all of the legal issues that have ensued. So was that fake news? Or was that just something that he wanted to push back on?
Trump has changed so many things about the presidency, not the least of which is the relationship with the media. Do you think it's a permanent change, or you think it's just involves Trump, and after Trump we'll go back to what's so-called normal?
Is there going to be an after Trump? Michael Cohen, when he gave his famous, testimony to Congress just a couple of weeks ago, and you can't, Michael Cohen is a proven liar and everything, but if you did choose to believe him, one of the things he said was that he thought he couldn't imagine that if Trump were actually defeated in 2020 that he would actually give up the office. So I don't know. But to answer your question, I don't know. I mean, I think let's say that let's say that Joe Biden, seems like could happen. Let's say Joe Biden is elected president in 2020. And, will all of these norms magically come back to where they were? I don't think they come back all the way, because I think the American public has changed its point of view in a lot of ways, and the government actually is going to reflect that. But, I do think it would sort of get back into where we have sort of a more normal situation. I mean, will there be, one of the interesting things that's happened from a media point of view is that there used to be these daily, almost daily press briefings. And now they're almost, they're very, very rare. Maybe once every 6 or 8 weeks or something like that. So there's a good question there. let's just say Joe Biden is elected, will there be daily press briefings? I don't know, maybe not. You know, maybe the feeling will be, well, we don't have to do that anymore because that tradition has gone away.
I've read some columns that you wrote. What do you think of Sarah Sanders as
Sarah
a press
Sanders?
as a press secretary?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it would be very tough to be Trump's press secretary because you're basically being asked to represent things the way he wants to see them rather than necessarily be tethered to the world of facts. But I think that she has, you know, it bothers me that she seems very disdainful to the journalists she's talking to. And there's a lot of put downs and there's a lot of sneering. So that bothers me a lot. And the fact that she and Sean Spicer before her were in the position at times of lying to the press, and that's pretty bad.
Let me ask you a hopelessly naive question that relates to American democracy. Just studying the patterns of American voters, how is it that the American electorate would vote for Obama and then in the very next election vote for Trump? When you put that out on a trend scale, how does that work?
So I don't think it's naive. I think it's one of the really interesting questions of our era. So one of the things I've done is gotten around to some different parts of the country and tried to look at that question and also about how people are informed and about their trust in the news media. So one of the places I went to was one of the, let's see, I have to remember how to say this, one of the OOT counties. In other words, Obama, this county, which is Luzerne County in Pennsylvania, which includes Scranton, voted Obama 2008, Obama 2012, Trump in 2016. And, you know, I talked to a lot of people there, and, you know, there's a few different factors. One is a lot of people just couldn't countenance Hillary. They just disliked her. I think some of that, I believe that some of that is sexism and misogyny. Some of it is, you know, and even her, I think she would even say, and some of her closest people would say, she made some pretty big mistakes during her campaign. She never even went to Wisconsin. You know, she didn't drive home the message about the economy, which might have helped. She basically only talked about how bad Trump was, and that was not a winning, turned out to be not a winning message. So I mean, I have to say too that I think that some of what President Trump played on with the American public, and one of the ways he attracted voters was, you know, he played to the backlash against a black president. So.
So the lesson for the Democratic candidates in 2020 is?
Well, I mean, I think I was sorry to see Sherrod Brown either drop out or decide not to run. I guess decide not to run. So the Ohio senator, who, you know, Ohio is now really a solid red state, but he's a Democrat, and he's able to get these strong results and be reelected pretty easily because he preaches the gospel of the dignity of work, and he talks about the economy. I mean, that's the other thing I found out as I went around the country. People care a lot less about, you know, I think, for example, you know, whether Elizabeth Warren once saw herself as Native American and put down Cherokee when she applied for something. I think they care a lot less about that and a lot more about whether, you know, what the economy is going to be like, whether their children are going to have as good a life as they have had, you know, what health care is going to be like for themselves and their children. I think pocketbook issues and you know, as we come into this time when we know that artificial intelligence is going to take over a lot of jobs, what's that going to do to the economy? What's it going to do to the dignity of work when so much work is going to be done, you know, by non-humans? So I think that, you know, talking in detail about the issues that people really care about is the most important thing.
And do you think there's a way that the media could or should cover the next presidential election in a way different from the way they covered the last one?
Yes, absolutely. I think that we need to drop this horse race coverage or do a lot less of it. So the media seems to be very, very fixated on who's winning. Well, they're bad at that, as we found out in 2016. They're terrible at it. You know, you would have thought Hillary was going to win because we were told that every day. So I think this horse race coverage that says, and you see it all the time, this person is ahead in the polls, their fundraising is better, they're obviously going to be the candidate. I think if we could go instead to something that a professor I know at NYU refers to as the citizens' agenda. The citizens' agenda is the opposite of horse race coverage. It basically looks at politics differently. It doesn't say who's going to win and who, you know, made a gaffe on the campaign trail and who did something stupid. I mean, you're always going to have that coverage too, obviously, but less about that and more about not just the issues, but also what's going to serve citizens best. How can we cover these candidates and the campaign in a way that serves voters rather than tries to make us look smart for knowing who's ahead?
And so Washington Post still is going to run its polls saying who's ahead.
Well, they don't really listen to me. I mean, I don't think, you know, everybody says, I hear people say this all the time. Has the press learned anything from since 2016? And I think the answer to that is you would need to want to learn something. And I don't, in general, I don't think that really, other than, oh, well, you know, we didn't understand how the heartland feels. I think there is some soul searching about that. We didn't really understand the country. But I don't think that there's any soul searching about this thing of horse race versus citizens' agenda. But we'll see. I mean, you know, so again, if they were to learn, they would need to want to learn, right? And I don't think it would just happen by magic. And I don't get any sense of, we got to do it differently. It's like we have to do the same thing, only better. And I think there's so much emphasis on scoop coverage. You know, who's got the scoop about this, you know, how there's turnover in so-and-so's campaign. Who cares? I mean, how does that serve the citizen? It's sort of the same, it's sort of a corollary to the kind of palace intrigue coverage of the White House that we see. Who's in, who's out? I mean, how does that matter to normal people? I don't think it does.
So Greg's going to ask a question, and then we're going to go to the audience. We have such a big crowd, we want to have enough time for you to engage in this conversation.
Absolutely. I just want to bring it full circle. It's hard to even start saying anything about fake news and the status of things without bringing up democracy and et cetera. And when my course was listed, you know, students like, oh, that's cool, fake news, you know, or you tell someone, what do you teach? Fake news. So the goal by the end of the first class is try to have them totally depressed.
Well, that shouldn't be too hard.
And make them see how serious it is. So
how serious is it?
How are we going to fix it?
Well,
you had a good column about, you know, there are various all these ideas about having a fake news flag online,
right?
Or
so how are we going to actually combat true misinformation that's out there that's going viral? I mean, I think one of the huge things we have to do is to emphasize, it's not really something that the news media does so much as what our society does, which is to emphasize news literacy. Like teach kids how to compare and contrast, how to recognize a story that's false, or a whole site that's devoted to being false and to tricking you. You know, to vary your offerings so that you're reading across different ideologies. So, you know, some of it is that. I'm not a huge believer in this sort of good housekeeping seal of approval on certain, because I think it gets political really fast. You know, this is a valid site, except that someone over here doesn't think it is.
Right.
So I mean, unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, some of it comes down to the news consumer. And I mean, this is really interesting, I thought. A study was done recently that said that most of the people who share, I'll use the words, I don't like to, but who share fake news are older, are like over 60 or something. You know, a huge number of the shares of true fake news were done by older people. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that we've got now a generation or almost two who are digital, who are smarter about what's going on in the digital world and aren't as likely to fall prey. Whereas I think some of the older generation, you know, grew up at a time when you kind of could trust the media to a large extent. And so they think, well, I'm seeing it, it must be true. And they're not quite as sort of hip to it as the younger folks are, who are able to say, well, that seems kind of weird. I think I will see where this came from and dig into it a little bit. So I think that's encouraging.
So, yeah, let's go to questions.
Let's go to questions. Yes, sir, right here in the front.
We're talking about an opinion label.
Mm-hmm.
If they would somehow make,
Yes.
like when you, if you, yes, the graphics just, that is an anchor really.
Right.
Could there be maybe a
Absolutely. No, I think that's a great idea. Did everybody hear that?
Well, for the TV audience particularly, you'd kind of summarize that?
Shall I repeat it?
Yeah.
I mean, it really is a terrific question. The question is basically, would it be helpful if news consumers could tell by looking at a show or a story in a newspaper or whatever they're looking at, is this news or is this opinion? And the idea here is, and the questioner is saying, if you're in an airport and the thing is on mute and you're looking at Sean Hannity on the set of Fox, he certainly looks like a news anchor. How are you supposed to know? And I do think it would be, I think labeling things is hugely important. And the more we can do that, the better off we are. I mean, I seriously question whether Fox News would want to do that. Yeah, they don't, so they don't want to, but I mean,
Okay.
but I think it would be useful, and it would be helpful, and it would be a good thing for this whole topic we're talking about.
Next question.
Yes. Right. Right. Yeah. Right. So, how are people supposed to know? Our questioner here says that, when you go on the New York Times, it might be in a category called opinion, but when you actually come to the piece itself, it's not clear. Or students or others may read it and say, well, this is I mean, I get this all the time. Why are you putting your opinion in here? I'm like, I'm a columnist.
But you know what, Margaret? Your picture runs there, and savvy newspaper followers know that means you're a columnist.
Yes, but we can't count on people to be that.
That's right. And so there ought to be a way,
Well,
you think.
and I just wanted to mention that about a year ago, maybe a little bit more, I mean, this speaks directly to your point. I mean, part of this is that the way we encounter news today, we're not actually, most of us, going to the newspaper where you're like, oh, here's the news section, and now I've turned to these pages and they say opinion on it. That is just not how we get informed anymore. They're coming to us in this disaggregated way. It's one piece. It's coming across my Facebook feed. It's on Twitter. It's my friend just sent it to me. So it's really important for each of those things to be labeled separately. So about, I don't know, maybe about a year or more ago, the Washington Post started doing this thing where they put a little label on most of these pieces. And not when it's news. It doesn't say news. But on mine it says perspective. And online, if you hover, or on your phone, if you hover over the word perspective, it actually describes what this thing is. this has a point of view which may include personal opinion or something like that. Analysis, opinion. And I mean, I actually found, this is non-scientific, okay? But I found when that started to be put on my columns, I was getting a lot less of, why are you putting your opinion in your story? Because people knew what it was. So I think, to your question, and same over here, that kind of labeling, but on each piece or on each program would be tremendously helpful.
Yes, sir, in the back, right here.
So, well, certainly streaming is, streaming news is a big deal. I think it'll continue to grow. It's interesting that you mentioned Reuters. So Reuters is, grows out of the idea of a wire service similar to the Associated Press or something like that. And Reuters is often mentioned as one of a very trusted, I think they're based in Britain. They're seen as non-biased. And so it's not, to me, it's never been so much about, is it streaming or is it on the web or is it on your phone or is it in print? To me, it's not so much about that. It's about what the actual content is. But I do think that's going to grow.
Yes, ma'am.
So the question here has to do with partisanship, and people see Fox News as conservative and they see the New York Times as liberal. So does the New York Times have an obligation to hire conservative people to sort of round things out, right? I mean, I think that it's good on editorial, let's talk about opinion voices, because I would hope that if I'm a news reporter at the New York Times or any place else, you're not going to know what my opinion is, what my point of view is. That should be in my opinion, that should be the aim, that you don't know. This is a, I mean, I don't want to, there's a prominent reporter at the Washington Post, Dan Balls. He's really highly respected. I have no idea whether he's a Republican, Democrat, I have no idea. And that's, I think, the way it should be. But to answer your question on the opinion side of things, yeah, sure, I think it's good to have a range of points of view. I wouldn't necessarily run out and hire any conservative I found on the street. I think there ought to be a level of, there needs to be a high level of talent, competency, experience, all those things. And I also think that, we tend to define this as, a liberal and a conservative. But there's other stuff in the world. There are gradations across that. There are also, everybody says, the New York Times is so liberal. But actually, the Times editorial page is probably kind of center-left-ish. It's, I'm not saying they should do this, but just to give the example, I haven't really noticed any, Democratic socialists writing for the New York Times. It's very narrow point. It's a very sort of narrow focus. It may be to the left, but, how far right do you want to go to? Yes, it's great to have a range of points of view, and I think it needs to be done the right way, the correct way.
Way in the back.
So was that, I guess maybe everybody heard that since you're in the
Probably,
back. But
probably not for the TV audience.
What is my view of the Jussie Smollett hoax in which? Yeah, I'm getting to that, don't worry. And how you call it, the left-wing media fell for the hoax, right? Yeah. I mean, I'm repeating your question. I'm not necessarily agreeing with you. I mean, I think that, the police it's kind of a tough situation. The police in Chicago were reporting that this is what had happened. This is how it unfolded. We are often too quick to draw conclusions. And I think that happened here, and particularly when it spun out from strict news coverage into commentary about it, it was very flawed, So that should be, that's absolutely a lesson in taking a little bit more time, trying to understand it, not letting opinion writers run wild with things that aren't necessarily factually proved yet.
Other question? Yes, sir.
Right, I saw that. Yeah, so the question here is Paul Ryan, prominent Republican politician who just left office, has been hired at pretty good salary to join the Fox News board. And what do I think about that, given the fact that there are issues about access and closeness and all of that? I mean, it's probably part of this whole thing that we're talking about. I don't think I mean, to me, a more outrageous example, not on Fox, but of somebody being hired who shouldn't have been hired, was on CNN when a Republican strategist and someone who had very recently been Jeff Sessions' spokesperson was hired on CNN as a political editor. I mean, Paul Ryan presumably is not going to call the shots about what stories Fox is going to cover. There may be some sort of politicking, but much worse, I think, was CNN's decision to take a political operative and make that person an editor. They've since backed off of that and said, no, she's just going to be a pundit, which they come in all sizes and shapes and colors, so that's okay, I think.
Other questions? Yes.
So, great. So the question is, since we were talking about the importance of getting that readership up, clicks, we want everybody to read us. We're looking for volume in terms of readership, and how do you put that into perspective when you're choosing topics and so on. I mean, I try not to dig too deep into those metrics. Which is kind of why I could be looking at those numbers myself rather than casually asking my editor how did the column do. I mean, I definitely know that there are plenty of journalists who study that pretty hard and want to play to that. I don't think that's what we should be paying attention to. We have to pay some attention to it, but you're not much of a journalist if you're making decisions about coverage based on what's going to drive readership in this kind of cheesy way that I'm talking about. If it's of course we all want to be read and we want our stories to engage people. That I think is a perfectly okay thing. and makes complete sense. But if we start saying, well, if I just put, if I just put up until recent, oh, okay, I have an example for you. If I just put this, this New York Congresswoman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? She's very popular. She's got this huge Instagram following. She's really compelling a lot of people. If I could just get her name into my headline, maybe Trump's name too, then, this column, this piece, whatever it is going to get great readership. I mean, I don't think we should be thinking that way. If it's of true interest, if there's real value there, then great. And of course, we want to write headlines that are going to engage people. And sometimes we try this one for a while and try this one for a while. I don't see anything wrong with that, but I wouldn't let it drive news judgment.
That's not a new phenomenon. Back in the 60s, the tabloids figured out there were a few key words that would sell with their headlines. And one was sex, and one was win.
Win?
Win, W-I-N, and one was free. So the ultimate headline was win free sex.
I mean, that's great. Yeah. If you could just work those two names into it, I think be in really good shape.
Yeah. Other questions? I wanted to ask you a question, Margaret, about the Washington Post after Jeff Bezos took it over. Tell us how that is, how it compares to pre-Bezos, and of course the Post has had phenomenal circulation increase as well.
Right. Well, it's great that he bought the paper. It's been about 5 or 6 years now. Previous to, I wasn't there, but before Bezos bought the paper, it was struggling. There were layoffs, there were bureaus being closed. There was there were real questions. Are we going to make it or are we not going to make it? When Bezos came in, he said, I want to give you runway. And what he meant by I want to give you runway is I want to give you the financial resources so that you can figure it out. You can figure out how to make it, how to make the business model work. And, the Post is profitable now. One of the big changes that was made was taking it from essentially a local paper with somewhat of a national reputation and all that to a true national paper that competes head-to-head with the New York Times and with other national publications and really tries for the national audience. So it's been a great thing. And, I've worked, not directly, but I've worked for 2 billionaires now, Bezos, and also when I was in Buffalo, the owner of the paper was Warren Buffett. So and both have been very good owners who were not involved editorially. They were hands off, but they were understood the business pretty much and were able to be supportive. So I think I've been pretty lucky.
So the key to the future of journalism is benign billionaires as owners.
It doesn't hurt. I mean, there's a great example of that in Los Angeles where the LA Times has been really struggling. And it was recently bought by, I guess, this man who's been called the world's richest doctor. He's an MD. And, now the Times is hiring. It's kind of getting its mojo back. And whether it will be able to develop a business model is another question. But it's, it beats the alternative.
Margaret, you've been just what we thought you would be. Very informative, provocative, and insightful.
Thank
we
you.
thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for having me.